In the late 19th century, in a nation still recovering from the scars of civil war and searching for new symbols of hope, prosperity, and identity, a strange brown liquid was born in the back room of a small pharmacy in Atlanta, Georgia. It did not arrive with fanfare or prophecy. It did not announce itself as a future empire. It did not promise to become one of the most powerful corporate forces in human history. It was created quietly, mixed carefully, poured into glass, and sold for 5 cents a cup. No one watching that first pour could have imagined that this syrup would one day shape global culture, redefine marketing, influence politics, rewrite public health narratives, and embed itself so deeply into human consciousness that billions of people would associate its taste with happiness itself. Coca-Cola did not simply become a drink. It became a symbol. It became a ritual. It became a belief system. And like all belief systems, it was built on desire, illusion, repetition, and control. The man behind the formula was not a visionary tycoon or a master strategist. He was a troubled pharmacist named John Stith Pemberton, a Confederate veteran wounded in battle and addicted to morphine, searching for a miracle cure that could save both his health and his finances. In the aftermath of war, the American South was broken, impoverished, and desperate for reinvention. Patent medicines flooded the market, promising relief from pain, fatigue, anxiety, and melancholy. These tonics were sold as scientific breakthroughs, yet most were little more than cocktails of alcohol, stimulants, and narcotics. Pemberton, trained in chemistry and medicine, believed he could create something better, something powerful, something that could restore vitality to a nation exhausted by bloodshed and loss. In 1886, Pemberton introduced his creation as a nerve tonic called Coca-Cola, named after 2 of its key ingredients, coca leaves and cola nuts. The coca leaves contained trace amounts of cocaine. The cola nuts were rich in caffeine. The syrup was designed to stimulate the mind, elevate the mood, and energize the body. It was marketed as a cure for headaches, fatigue, impotence, and even addiction. In an era when regulation was nearly non-existent, these claims were not only accepted, they were expected. Coca-Cola was positioned not as a soft drink, but as a medicine. A miracle in a glass. The formula was mixed with carbonated water at Jacob's Pharmacy and served over ice. Customers described it as refreshing, invigorating, and strangely addictive. Within months, Coca-Cola was selling dozens of glasses a day. Pemberton had stumbled onto something far more powerful than he realized. But he would never live to see what his invention would become. Sick, broke, and still battling addiction, Pemberton began selling off portions of his formula and company to various partners. He died in 1888, just 2 years after creating Coca-Cola, leaving behind a recipe, a name, and a fragile business with no clear future. The true architect of the Coca-Cola empire was not its inventor. It was a man named Asa Griggs Candler. Candler was a businessman, a drug wholesaler, and a marketing genius. Where Pemberton saw medicine, Candler saw opportunity. He acquired full ownership of Coca-Cola for a total of about $2,300, a sum that would later become one of the most profitable investments in human history. Candler did not care about tonics or cures. He cared about scale, brand, and dominance. He understood something fundamental about human behavior. People do not buy products. They buy stories. They buy emotions. They buy identity. Under Candler's leadership, Coca-Cola transformed from a local curiosity into a national obsession. He removed the medicinal claims and repositioned the drink as a symbol of pleasure, refreshment, and modern life. Coca-Cola was no longer a remedy. It was a lifestyle. It was no longer sold as a cure. It was sold as a feeling. And that feeling was happiness. Candler invested aggressively in advertising at a time when few companies believed in the power of mass marketing. Coca-Cola ads appeared on calendars, clocks, street signs, newspapers, and billboards. The logo became omnipresent. The script was elegant, timeless, unforgettable. Candler understood that repetition creates trust, and trust creates loyalty. Coca-Cola became familiar, and familiarity became comfort. In a rapidly industrializing America, where cities were expanding, factories were rising, and life was becoming faster and more mechanical, Coca-Cola positioned itself as a moment of pleasure in a world of stress. By the early 1900s, Coca-Cola was being sold across the United States. Bottling plants opened in city after city. The drink was standardized, ensuring that no matter where someone tasted it, it would always feel the same. Consistency became part of the mythology. Coca-Cola was no longer just a beverage. It was a promise. But behind the smiling faces in the advertisements and the cheerful slogans was a far more aggressive strategy. Candler's empire was built on exclusivity contracts, legal warfare, and relentless control of distribution. Soda fountains were pressured to serve Coca-Cola and no other cola. Competitors were crushed through lawsuits and intimidation. The company fought to protect its trademark, its formula, and its dominance. Coca-Cola was not just competing in the market. It was conquering it. The formula itself became one of the most guarded secrets in business history. The recipe was locked in a vault. Only a handful of executives were allowed to know its exact composition. This secrecy transformed Coca-Cola into something mythological. The drink was no longer just sugar and caffeine. It was alchemy. It was magic. It was mystery. And mystery creates desire. As the 20th century unfolded, Coca-Cola grew alongside America's rise as a global superpower. The company expanded internationally, following U.S. troops into war zones and foreign cities. During World War II, Coca-Cola promised that every American soldier could buy a bottle for 5 cents, no matter where they were stationed. The company built bottling plants near military bases across Europe and the Pacific. Coca-Cola became a symbol of home, a reminder of America, a taste of comfort in a world of chaos. When the war ended, those bottling plants remained. Coca-Cola was now embedded in dozens of countries. It had built the infrastructure of a global empire under the cover of patriotism. While governments focused on rebuilding cities and economies, Coca-Cola focused on capturing minds. It marketed itself as the drink of peace, prosperity, and modernity. To drink Coca-Cola was to participate in the American dream. The company did not simply sell soda. It sold aspiration. It sold youth. It sold freedom. It sold belonging. Coca-Cola became a cultural artifact. It appeared in movies, music, art, and literature. It was photographed in the hands of celebrities and workers alike. It crossed class boundaries. It crossed borders. It crossed ideologies. Even in countries hostile to American influence, Coca-Cola found its way into black markets and underground shops. The drink became a form of soft power, a silent ambassador of capitalism. Yet beneath the glossy surface of global happiness, a darker story was forming. Coca-Cola's success was built on sugar, caffeine, and psychological engineering. It trained consumers to crave sweetness at a scale never seen before. It normalized daily consumption of liquid sugar. It helped shape a global diet that would later fuel epidemics of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. But for decades, these consequences were invisible, or ignored, or quietly buried beneath billions of dollars in advertising. Coca-Cola mastered the art of emotional manipulation. Its campaigns were not about taste. They were about connection, friendship, family, love, Christmas, summer, youth, joy. The company did not sell a beverage. It sold moments. It sold memories. It sold identity. To drink Coca-Cola was to feel part of something bigger than yourself. The company's most famous creation was not its formula. It was its version of Santa Claus. In the 1930s, Coca-Cola commissioned a series of advertisements featuring a jolly, red-suited Santa enjoying a bottle of Coke. This image became the global standard for Santa Claus. Coca-Cola did not invent Christmas, but it shaped how the world imagines it. A corporate logo helped define a cultural myth. As Coca-Cola entered the post-war golden age of television, its influence only deepened. Commercials played between sitcoms and news broadcasts. Children grew up associating the brand with cartoons, jingles, and smiling polar bears. The company understood something fundamental about human psychology. Loyalty is strongest when it begins in childhood. Coca-Cola did not wait for customers to grow up. It raised them. By the 1960s and 1970s, Coca-Cola had become one of the most recognizable brands on Earth. Its red and white logo was known in remote villages and massive cities alike. The company's reach extended into over 200 countries. It employed hundreds of thousands of people directly and indirectly. It controlled a vast web of bottlers, distributors, and retailers. Coca-Cola was no longer just a company. It was a system. A global machine of production, marketing, and consumption. But power always attracts scrutiny. And as Coca-Cola's empire expanded, so did its critics. Doctors began questioning the health impact of sugary drinks. Governments began debating regulation. Activists began investigating the company's labor practices and environmental footprint. In some countries, Coca-Cola was accused of exploiting water resources, polluting ecosystems, and undermining local communities. In others, it was linked to union suppression and political influence. The company responded not with retreat, but with strategy. Coca-Cola invested heavily in lobbying. It funded research designed to shift blame for obesity away from sugar and toward lack of exercise. It sponsored sports events and fitness programs, positioning itself as part of an active lifestyle. It adapted its messaging, but never its core objective: growth. Every criticism became a challenge to be managed. Every scandal became a story to be reshaped. Coca-Cola did not merely defend its reputation, it engineered it. The company understood that perception is reality, and reality is negotiable. At its peak, Coca-Cola was more than a beverage brand. It was one of the most powerful corporations in history. Its annual revenues reached tens of billions of dollars. Its influence extended into politics, media, science, and culture. It had become so deeply embedded in daily life that most people no longer questioned its presence. A Coca-Cola bottle on a table felt as natural as water. And yet, the very qualities that made Coca-Cola unstoppable also made it dangerous. A system built on addiction, sugar, and psychological conditioning does not easily disappear. It evolves. It adapts. It reshapes itself to survive. Today, Coca-Cola markets itself as a company of choices. It sells water, juice, tea, energy drinks, and diet soda. It speaks the language of wellness and sustainability. It promises a healthier future. But its core product remains the same: sweet, fizzy, addictive, familiar. Coca-Cola is no longer just a drink you buy. It is a habit you inherit, a memory you share, a feeling you recognize. It lives in refrigerators, vending machines, stadiums, schools, and hospitals. It is present at weddings and funerals, at celebrations and heartbreaks. It is woven into the fabric of modern life. The disturbing history of Coca-Cola is not just about a beverage. It is about how a simple formula became a global belief system, how marketing became mythology, how sugar became culture, how a corporation learned to shape desire at planetary scale. And this is only the beginning of the story, because the real power of Coca-Cola is not in what it sells, but in how deeply it has taught the world to want it. And once desire is engineered, it never truly disappears. As Coca-Cola tightened its grip on the 20th century, it perfected a machine that did not merely sell products, but manufactured emotion. By the middle of the 1900s, the company had already learned that the real battlefield was not the supermarket shelf, but the human mind. Flavor could be copied. Bottles could be replicated. Prices could be undercut. But identity could not be cloned. Coca-Cola did not aim to be the best cola. It aimed to be the only one that mattered. The rise of television transformed Coca-Cola from a brand into a constant presence. It entered living rooms, kitchens, and childhood memories. Its jingles became cultural anthems. Its commercials became shared experiences. In a fragmented society, Coca-Cola created common ground. Everyone recognized the logo. Everyone knew the taste. Everyone understood the message. It was happiness, bottled. Optimism, carbonated. Belonging, chilled and served with ice. This emotional architecture was not accidental. Coca-Cola employed psychologists, behavioral researchers, and marketing strategists to decode human desire. The company studied how colors triggered appetite, how sound influenced perception, how repetition built trust, and how nostalgia deepened loyalty. The red label was not just aesthetic, it was psychological. Red signaled energy, excitement, passion, urgency. The curve of the bottle was designed to be sensual, recognizable even in the dark. The sound of a can opening was engineered to be satisfying. Every detail was intentional. Coca-Cola understood that humans are not rational consumers. They are emotional creatures. They buy what makes them feel something. And Coca-Cola made them feel safe. In an uncertain world of wars, recessions, social upheaval, and technological change, Coca-Cola offered consistency. It tasted the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. In a world constantly transforming, Coca-Cola became a constant. But this stability came at a cost. As consumption increased, so did dependence. The sugar content of Coca-Cola was not incidental. It was fundamental. Sugar triggers dopamine. It activates the brain's reward system. It creates pleasure, followed by craving. Coca-Cola did not invent sugar addiction, but it industrialized it. It packaged it. It branded it.
It sold it to children.
By the 1970s and 1980s, Coca-Cola was facing an enemy it had not anticipated: science. Medical research began linking sugary drinks to obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. Public health experts sounded the alarm. Governments began discussing regulation. The idea that Coca-Cola was harmless refreshment was being challenged. The company responded with one of the most sophisticated corporate defense strategies ever constructed. It did not deny the science, it reframed it. Coca-Cola funded studies that emphasized exercise over diet. It promoted the idea of energy balance, suggesting that weight gain was caused not by sugar, but by laziness. It positioned itself as a supporter of sports, sponsoring the Olympics, the World Cup, and countless athletic programs. The message was clear: drink Coke, just move more. This narrative was powerful because it shifted responsibility from the corporation to the individual. If you were unhealthy, it was your fault. Not the products. Not the marketing. Not the billions spent targeting children. The company mastered the art of blame deflection. At the same time, Coca-Cola expanded aggressively into emerging markets. As soda consumption plateaued in the United States, the company turned its attention to Latin America, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. These regions represented billions of new consumers. Coca-Cola invested heavily in local infrastructure, building bottling plants, distribution networks, and retail partnerships. In many developing countries, Coca-Cola became more accessible than clean drinking water. In parts of rural Mexico, villagers could buy Coca-Cola more easily than they could find potable water. The drink became a daily staple. In some communities, it was used in religious ceremonies. In others, it was given to children in baby bottles. Diabetes rates soared. Obesity exploded. Coca-Cola became both a symbol of modernity and a driver of public health crises. The company denied responsibility. It emphasized choice. It emphasized freedom. It emphasized enjoyment. Coca-Cola did not force anyone to drink its products. It simply made sure they were everywhere. As Coca-Cola's influence deepened, so did its political power. The company became one of the most active corporate lobbyists in the world. It fought soda taxes, labeling regulations, advertising restrictions, and school bans. It partnered with governments while simultaneously pressuring them. It positioned itself as a job creator, an investor, a national partner. Coca-Cola was not just a business operating within political systems. It was a force shaping them. In some countries, Coca-Cola executives moved seamlessly between corporate leadership and government roles. The revolving door between politics and business spun quietly, efficiently. Decisions about public health were influenced by corporate interests. Regulations were softened. Investigations were delayed. Accountability was diluted. Yet, Coca-Cola's greatest strength remained its mythology. The brand continued to project an image of joy, unity, and optimism. Its holiday commercials brought families together. Its campaigns celebrated diversity, love, and togetherness. Coca-Cola spoke the language of humanity. It wrapped itself in virtue. This duality became its defining characteristic. Behind the scenes, Coca-Cola operated as a ruthless, data-driven empire. On the surface, it appeared as a benevolent cultural institution. The gap between perception and reality widened, but most consumers never saw it. The company's grip on popular culture remained absolute. Musicians sang about Coke. Films placed it on screen. Artists turned its logo into commentary. Andy Warhol famously said that Coca-Cola was the great equalizer. The same Coke was enjoyed by presidents and factory workers alike. But this equality was illusion. The costs of consumption were not shared equally. The profits flowed upward. The health consequences flowed downward. By the turn of the 21st century, Coca-Cola had become one of the most powerful brands ever created. Its valuation reached hundreds of billions of dollars. It sold billions of servings every day. It employed armies of marketers, engineers, and strategists. Its data on consumer behavior rivaled that of governments. And yet, it faced a world that was changing. Younger generations were questioning sugar. Wellness culture was rising. Environmental awareness was spreading. Plastic pollution became impossible to ignore. Coca-Cola was now one of the largest plastic polluters on Earth, producing billions of bottles annually. Beaches, rivers, and oceans were filling with red-labeled waste. The company responded with sustainability campaigns, recycling initiatives, and promises of greener futures. It spoke of responsibility. It spoke of innovation. But its production volumes continued to rise. Coca-Cola had become too big to stop, too embedded to disappear, too powerful to challenge easily. And so the story of Coca-Cola entered its most complex phase. A phase where the brand had to reconcile its mythology with its impact. A phase where it had to sell both indulgence and responsibility. A phase where it had to convince the world that it could remain a symbol of happiness in an era increasingly aware of its cost. Coca-Cola was no longer just a drink of pleasure. It was a case study in corporate influence, a lesson in behavioral engineering, a monument to the power of storytelling. It had rewritten what a beverage could be. It had reshaped what a brand could become. It had proven that with enough repetition, emotion, and scale, a company could insert itself into the deepest layers of human life. And yet the most disturbing truth of Coca-Cola is not found in its ingredients, its marketing, or its lobbying. It is found in its invisibility. Most people do not see Coca-Cola as a corporation. They see it as a friend, a tradition, a memory, a comfort. And that is the ultimate achievement of power. To become so familiar that you are no longer questioned. To become so loved that you are no longer examined. To become so omnipresent that you are no longer noticed. Coca-Cola did not conquer the world through force. It conquered it through feeling. And once a brand becomes a feeling, it becomes almost impossible to remove. Because you cannot boycott a memory. You cannot cancel nostalgia. And you cannot easily let go of something that taught you what happiness tastes like. Coca-Cola's empire did not grow by accident. It grew through architecture, through systems, through distribution networks that wrapped around the planet like arteries carrying sugar instead of blood. By the early 2000s, Coca-Cola was no longer a beverage company. It was a logistics giant, a marketing colossus, a political operator, a psychological institution. Its bottling system became one of the most sophisticated supply chains ever built. Independent bottlers operated under Coca-Cola's command, bound by contracts that dictated everything from pricing to branding to shelf placement. Local entrepreneurs bore the operational risks while Coca-Cola controlled the intellectual property, the image, the recipe, and the margins. It was an empire without borders, a decentralized army marching under a single red flag. In countries where infrastructure barely existed, Coca-Cola built it. Roads were laid, warehouses constructed, refrigeration systems installed. In many regions, Coca-Cola trucks reached villages before government services did. In some areas, Coca-Cola became more reliable than electricity, more predictable than healthcare, more present than the state. This was not charity. It was conquest. Coca-Cola understood that access was power. The easier the drink was defined, the more invisible the decision became. When something is everywhere, you stop questioning it. You stop evaluating it. You stop resisting it. It becomes part of the environment like air or water. The company invested billions to ensure that when thirst struck, Coca-Cola would be the first thought. Vending machines in schools, coolers in hospitals, sponsorships at stadiums, billboards on highways, logos in music videos, product placement in films. It was omnipresence by design. And then there was data. Long before most corporations understood the value of behavioral analytics, Coca-Cola was building massive intelligence systems. It tracked purchasing habits, regional preferences, weather patterns, cultural trends, and emotional triggers. It ran experiments on pricing, packaging, placement, and messaging. Every decision was measured. Every campaign optimized. Every emotion monetized. Coca-Cola did not just sell to people. It studied them. It learned how temperature affected consumption, how stress increased sugar cravings, how poverty correlated with soda dependency, how children formed brand loyalty before they could read, how family rituals could be shaped around a product, how holidays could be rewritten around a bottle. In many cultures, Coca-Cola did not replace existing traditions. It absorbed them. It wrapped itself around Christmas. It merged with weddings. It entered funerals. It became part of religious ceremonies. In parts of Mexico, Coca-Cola was offered to saints. In some communities, it was believed to have healing properties. The carbonation was thought to release evil spirits. The sugar was thought to bring strength. A corporation had become spiritual. This is what happens when branding crosses into mythology. When commerce enters belief, when consumption becomes ritual. But behind the magic was an industry built on extraction. Massive quantities of water were required to produce Coca-Cola's beverages. In water-scarce regions, bottling plants drained aquifers, wells dried up, rivers shrank. Farmers lost access to irrigation, communities protested, activists documented environmental damage. Lawsuits were filed. Coca-Cola responded with familiar language: sustainability, responsibility, partnership. It launched water stewardship programs. It promised to replenish what it used. It published glossy reports filled with images of smiling children and green landscapes. Yet in many places, the damage had already been done. In India, villagers accused Coca-Cola plants of contaminating groundwater. In Colombia, union leaders claimed intimidation and violence. In Latin America, public health advocates fought against aggressive marketing to children. In Africa, doctors warned of rising diabetes rates linked to soda consumption. The brand that sold happiness was leaving behind a trail of ecological and medical consequences. Still, Coca-Cola's power remained unmatched. Governments hesitated to confront it. Regulators moved slowly. Courts dragged on for years. The company's legal teams were vast, its influence deep, its lobbying relentless. Coca-Cola had learned that in modern capitalism, scale creates immunity. The bigger you become, the harder you are to challenge. The more jobs you create, the more governments depend on you. The more taxes you pay, the more leverage you gain. The more cultural capital you accumulate, the more public goodwill you can spend. And Coca-Cola had more goodwill than almost any brand on earth. Even as evidence mounted, the emotional bond held strong. People did not want to believe that something so familiar could be harmful. They did not want to question a symbol of childhood, of celebration, of togetherness. Coca-Cola had embedded itself into identity. For millions, it was not a product. It was part of who they were. The company leaned into this bond. It personalized bottles with names. It launched campaigns about friendship, love, and belonging. It told people that Coca-Cola was not just something you drank. It was something you shared. This strategy was devastatingly effective. Sharing is social. Sharing is moral. Sharing is human. Coca-Cola made consumption feel like connection. But connection, when engineered by a corporation, becomes a mechanism of control. Because once a brand owns your memories, it owns your loyalty. And once it owns your loyalty, it owns your future decisions. This is the true architecture of Coca-Cola's empire. Not factories, not trucks. Not vending machines. The real infrastructure lives in the mind. It is built from nostalgia, from repetition, from emotion, from ritual, from identity. And once constructed, it is almost impossible to dismantle. Coca-Cola did not merely survive the 20th century. It mastered it. It learned how to speak the language of mass media, how to exploit the psychology of desire, how to convert sugar into power, how to transform a drink into a doctrine. By the time the world entered the digital age, Coca-Cola was already prepared. Its marketing migrated to social media. Its influencers multiplied. Its data systems expanded. Its targeting became more precise. Its storytelling more immersive. The brand adapted to every new platform without losing its core mythology. Happiness, togetherness, refreshment, optimism. These words followed Coca-Cola into every generation. And yet, beneath the smiling faces and glowing bottles, a question began to surface. What happens when a company becomes more powerful than the systems meant to regulate it? What happens when a product becomes more trusted than science? What happens when a brand becomes more influential than governments? What happens when sugar becomes policy? Coca-Cola had become a global institution. But institutions are not immortal. They are tested, they are challenged, they are exposed. And as the 21st century unfolded, Coca-Cola would face a reckoning unlike any it had ever known. A reckoning not only about health, not only about water, not only about plastic, but about truth. Because the more powerful a story becomes, the more dangerous it is when people stop believing it. And the world was beginning to wake up. The myth was cracking, the spell was weakening, the empire was being questioned. And Coca-Cola, for the first time in its history, would have to confront a future where happiness was no longer enough. The reckoning did not arrive with a single scandal or a single headline. It came slowly, through accumulating evidence, through rising awareness, through a generational shift in values. The world that Coca-Cola had helped shape was changing. And for the first time in its long reign, the company found itself chasing culture instead of defining it. A new generation was questioning everything. What they consumed, what they supported, what they believed. Wellness was no longer a niche trend, it was a global movement. Sugar became the new tobacco. Plastic became the new oil. Corporations were no longer admired simply for their size. They were judged for their impact. For Coca-Cola, this represented an existential challenge. The company that once symbolized progress was now associated with disease. The brand that once represented joy was now linked to obesity, diabetes, and environmental destruction. The product that once unified generations was now viewed by many as a relic of a less informed age. And yet, Coca-Cola did not retreat. It evolved. The company launched a new identity campaign, positioning itself not as a soda company, but as a total beverage company. It expanded aggressively into bottled water, juices, teas, coffees, energy drinks, sports drinks, plant-based beverages, and functional nutrition. It acquired brands, it invested in startups. It bought its way into wellness. Coca-Cola Zero, Coke Light, Coke Energy. Coke with coffee, Coke with fiber, Coke with vitamins. The company was no longer selling soda. It was selling relevance. It was selling adaptation. It was selling survival. But even as Coca-Cola diversified its portfolio, its core business remained unchanged. The majority of its revenue still came from sugary beverages. The heart of the empire still pumped sugar into the bloodstream of the global population. The contradiction became impossible to ignore. Coca-Cola wanted to be seen as a champion of health while remaining dependent on products that undermined it. It wanted to be seen as an environmental leader while producing billions of plastic bottles every year. It wanted to be seen as socially responsible while lobbying against public health regulations. It wanted to be seen as progressive while protecting a business model built on addiction. This tension defined the modern Coca-Cola. The company began publishing sustainability reports, outlining its goals for carbon neutrality, water replenishment, and packaging recycling. It pledged to collect and recycle a bottle or can for everyone it sold. It promised to reduce sugar. It promised to innovate. But critics argued that these promises were cosmetic. That the scale of Coca-Cola's production dwarfed its environmental initiatives. That its recycling campaigns shifted responsibility to consumers while avoiding systemic change. That its water replenishment programs could not undo aquifer depletion. Coca-Cola had mastered the language of responsibility. But language without transformation is just branding. Activists around the world intensified their campaigns. Environmental groups tracked Coca-Cola's plastic waste across oceans and beaches. Public health organizations pushed for soda taxes. Cities banned large-sized sodas. Schools removed vending machines. Doctors warned parents. Governments debated regulation. In some countries, Coca-Cola became a political symbol. A stand-in for corporate excess, a target for protest. A case study in unchecked capitalism. And yet the brand endured. Because Coca-Cola did not just sell drinks. It sold identity. In a world of infinite choice, Coca-Cola represented certainty. In a world of fragmentation, it represented unity. In a world of anxiety, it represented comfort. People did not drink Coca-Cola because it was healthy. They drank it because it made them feel something. And feelings are stronger than facts. This is the psychology Coca-Cola had spent more than a century perfecting. The company understood that rational arguments rarely defeat emotional bonds, that statistics do not erase memories. That logic does not dissolve nostalgia. Coca-Cola had not just built a customer base. It had built a following, a belief system, a mythology. And like all powerful myths, it resisted collapse. Still, the cracks continued to spread. Internal documents leaked. Whistleblowers spoke. Investigations revealed decades of lobbying against health regulations. Reports detailed the company's role in shaping scientific narratives. Journalists exposed partnerships designed to influence policy. The image of the benevolent brand began to fracture. Coca-Cola responded with transparency campaigns. It opened its factories to tours. It published ingredient breakdowns. It launched interactive platforms. It invited scrutiny. But transparency is selective. What Coca-Cola revealed was carefully curated. What it hid was protected by lawyers. What it admitted was controlled. And what it denied was buried in bureaucracy. The corporation had become too complex to fully understand, too global to fully regulate, too entrenched to fully reform. Coca-Cola was no longer just a company. It was an ecosystem. A network of bottlers, distributors, suppliers, advertisers, lobbyists, and partners spread across every continent. It employed millions. It generated billions. It influenced trillions in consumer spending. Its collapse would not just affect shareholders. It would affect governments, economies, communities, entire industries. This is the paradox of modern corporate power. The more damage a company causes, the harder it becomes to dismantle, because the system itself becomes dependent on it. Coca-Cola had become too big to fail, too familiar to reject, too embedded to escape. And so the world continued to drink, not because it was unaware, but because it was attached. This is the final stage of corporate influence, when a brand becomes a habit, when a habit becomes identity, when identity becomes loyalty, and loyalty becomes immunity. Coca-Cola had reached that stage. The stage where criticism no longer mattered, where scandal no longer shocked, where contradiction no longer threatened, because the brand had transcended logic. It had become culture. But cultures evolve. They fracture. They are challenged by new generations. They are rewritten by new values. And Coca-Cola now stood at the edge of a new era, an era defined by climate crisis, by health emergencies, by digital transparency, by corporate accountability. An era where power is no longer admired without question. An era where influence is no longer invisible. An era where myths are interrogated. Coca-Cola had survived wars, depressions, revolutions, pandemics, technological shifts, cultural revolutions. But the greatest challenge it now faced was not competition. It was consciousness. A world that no longer wanted to be manipulated. A generation that no longer trusted corporations. A society that no longer accepted sugar-coated narratives. The empire built on happiness was being asked to prove its value. Not through commercials. Not through slogans. Not through nostalgia. But through truth. And truth is a currency Coca-Cola had never needed to trade in before. Until now. The question was no longer whether Coca-Cola could adapt. The question was whether it could survive a world that finally understood what it was drinking. The future of Coca-Cola is not written in sugar and bubbles anymore. It is written in data, in psychology, in geopolitics, in climate models, in artificial intelligence, in behavioral science, and in the invisible architecture of global influence. The company that once sold medicine in a pharmacy now operates as one of the most sophisticated systems of mass persuasion ever constructed. Coca-Cola no longer simply manufactures beverages. It engineers desire. It designs nostalgia. It manufactures belonging. It builds emotional dependency at planetary scale. And as the world moves deeper into uncertainty, polarization, and technological acceleration, Coca-Cola is preparing for a future where the battle is no longer for shelf space, but for mental real estate. Inside Coca-Cola's Atlanta headquarters, entire divisions are now dedicated not to product development, but to behavioral prediction. Algorithms analyze millions of data points every second. Purchase patterns, emotional reactions to advertising, social media sentiment, cultural shifts, generational anxieties, political movements, health trends, climate anxiety, urbanization, loneliness, nostalgia cycles. Coca-Cola studies not just what people drink, but why they drink, when they drink, who they drink with, what they feel when they drink. What memories are triggered, what insecurities are soothed, what identity is reinforced, what longing is momentarily silenced. The company understands something fundamental about modern humanity. People do not buy beverages. They buy rituals. They buy comfort. They buy moments of control in a chaotic world. They buy connection in a fragmented society. They buy familiarity in an age of overwhelming change. And Coca-Cola positions itself not as a refreshment, but as an emotional anchor. In a world where everything feels unstable, Coca-Cola promises one thing will never change. The taste, the logo, the color, the feeling, the illusion of permanence. But permanence is fragile. The world is changing faster than Coca-Cola ever anticipated. Governments are tightening regulations. Sugar taxes are spreading across continents. Health consciousness is rising. Gen Z is less loyal to legacy brands and more skeptical of corporate narratives. Climate crises are forcing water restrictions. Plastic pollution is triggering global outrage. And the old model of unlimited growth is colliding with the physical limits of the planet. For the first time in its history, Coca-Cola is being asked a question it cannot answer with advertising. How do you build an empire on consumption in a world running out of resources? How do you sell sugar in a world fighting diabetes? How do you sell plastic bottles in a world drowning in plastic waste? How do you sell happiness when your product is increasingly associated with disease, pollution, and exploitation? The company's response has been carefully calculated. A new narrative, sustainability campaigns, green branding, carbon neutrality pledges, recyclable bottles, water stewardship programs, community investments, health initiatives, zero sugar lines, functional beverages, wellness branding, influencer partnerships, social justice messaging, cultural alignment, digital activism. Coca-Cola is reinventing its image for a generation that no longer trusts corporations. But critics argue that much of this is cosmetic, greenwashing, health washing, narrative laundering. The machine continues to extract water from vulnerable regions. Plastic continues to flood oceans. Sugar continues to fuel metabolic disease. Lobbying continues to block regulation. Marketing continues to target children. And the system continues to operate exactly as it always has. Maximize consumption, minimize accountability, control perception, shape culture, influence policy, protect profit. Coca-Cola does not simply respond to the world. It shapes it. In many countries, Coca-Cola is more present than the government. In rural villages, Coca-Cola arrives before clean water. In disaster zones, Coca-Cola trucks arrive before aid organizations. In war zones, Coca-Cola bottles sit next to rifles. In refugee camps, Coca-Cola logos hang beside humanitarian banners. The brand has embedded itself so deeply into the fabric of global civilization that it has become inseparable from modern life. And that is the most unsettling truth of all. Coca-Cola is no longer a company. It is an institution, a cultural force, a psychological architecture, a behavioral operating system, a global ritual, a shared myth, a corporate religion. Its red logo is a flag, its bottle is a symbol, its taste is a memory. Its advertising is scripture, its slogans are prayers, its commercials are hymns. Its legacy is worshipped across generations. It has mastered something more powerful than technology, more powerful than politics, more powerful than armies. It has mastered emotion. The company understands that humans are not rational. We are driven by habit, nostalgia, identity, fear, comfort, belonging. We do not choose brands logically. We choose them emotionally. And Coca-Cola has spent more than a century studying the human mind with surgical precision. It knows how to make people feel safe. It knows how to make people feel young. It knows how to make people feel connected. It knows how to make people feel normal. It knows how to make people feel included. It knows how to make people feel happy, even if that happiness lasts only a few seconds. And in a world where happiness feels increasingly rare, those seconds are priceless. The future Coca-Cola is building is not just about beverages, it is about owning moments. Owning rituals, owning celebrations, owning loneliness, owning joy, owning heartbreak, owning nostalgia, owning identity, owning culture, owning memory, owning meaning. The question is no longer whether Coca-Cola will survive the next century. It almost certainly will. The question is what kind of world it will help create. A world where water is privatized, where health is commodified, where addiction is normalized, where consumption is endless, where corporations replace governments, where brands replace communities, where logos replace flags, where happiness is bottled, where memory is monetized, where identity is sponsored, or a world where humanity finally confronts the cost of its empires, because Coca-Cola is not unique. It is the blueprint, the prototype, the original corporate machine. The first company to truly understand that in the modern age, power does not come from force. It comes from influence. It comes from perception. It comes from storytelling. It comes from psychology. It comes from making people love the very system that exploits them. Coca-Cola did not conquer the world with weapons. It conquered it with sugar, color, and emotion. It did not demand loyalty. It seduced it. It did not impose dominance. It made dominance feel like friendship. And that is why its story matters. Because Coca-Cola is not just about soda. It is about how modern empires are built. It is about how corporations become governments, how brands become belief systems, how advertising becomes culture, how consumption becomes identity, how desire becomes control. It is about how power looks in the 21st century. Not as a crown, not as a throne, not as an army, but as a red logo glowing quietly in the corner of your life. Watching, waiting, selling. The most powerful empires no longer rule nations. They rule minds, and Coca-Cola is one of their architects. In the end, the story of Coca-Cola is not the story of a drink. It is the story of us, of our cravings, our fears, our longing for connection, our vulnerability to comfort, our willingness to trade health for pleasure, our tendency to mistake familiarity for safety, our desire to believe that happiness can be bought, bottled, and consumed. It is the story of how an idea became a habit, how a habit became a culture, how a culture became a system, and how a system became invisible. The bottle in your hand is not just a beverage, it is a century of psychology, a century of manipulation, a century of persuasion, a century of empire. And whether we choose to keep drinking from it is not a question of taste. It is a question of consciousness.